Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Nina Livesey. Nina E. Livesey received her PhD from Southern Methodist University, Dallas, Texas, and is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at the Okhlahoma University College of Professional and Continuing Studies. Trained in biblical studies with a specialization in Pauline letters, Nina's interests can be broadly characterized as the investigation into various aspects of Christian emergence. Her first monograph, Circumcision as a Malleable Symbol, Mohr Siebeck 2010, explores interpretations of the Hebrew rite of circumcision across a diversity of ancient texts and challenges a common assumption of a unitary signification of this Judean practice. Her second monograph, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, Demosthenes, Cicero, and Paul, Polebridge Press 2016, which this interview is based upon, and a link to purchase that book is in the Amazon affiliate link in the description below. That book is a comparative study of the rhetoric of urgency, encomium, emotive language, and disjuncture across the Philippic speeches of Demosthenes and Cicero and Paul's letters to the Galatians. Against traditional scholarship, the book provides evidence of a wide use of rhetoric in Galatians, and her current work involves an analysis of Pauline letters more generally, including their status. To that end, she has a book that is coming out soon. It is titled The Letters of Paul and Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. The link to pre-order the book is also in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below. So welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Livesey.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Appreciate the invitation very much.
And thank you for accepting and joining me today. What does Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis aim to show, and how did the writing of this book affect your thinking about Paul?
Well, as you said a little bit in the introduction, this book aims to show Paul's extensive use of rhetoric to get his points across. And I came away with the notion that Galatians is top to bottom rhetorical discourse. And I was able to show this, and as you mentioned, by comparing Galatians to the Philippic speeches of two well-known orators, Demosthenes and Cicero, and they're both known for their rhetorical prowess. So I began with the observation, this is really the beginning of that book, of Paul's rather extensive use of hyperbole, gross exaggerations, and even falsehoods when speaking about the Torah. Thus, he remarks the Torah does not come from God, but an intermediary was given provisionally, and that those who rely on so-called works of the law are under a curse. He suggests that law adherence is burdensome and that it brings about a state of enslavement. At the time of that writing, I was also operating under the common and still popular assumption among Pauline scholars and others that Paul was himself a Jew. So how could a Jew be saying such things? I concluded from these gross exaggerations that something else was at play or at stake, and that something else was lying behind those negative assessments of Torah. And to determine what that was, I turned to the letter of Galatians to provide the context, or what can be called the rhetorical situation, and became persuaded that it was Paul's opponents that prompted his statements. As is known from looking at the situation of the letter, some other competing authority figures were attempting to convince the Galatians to take up the practice of Torah, including circumcision. So I determined, again, from the situation of the letter, that these unnamed competitors or opponents dictated the contours of the arguments that Paul was making. So in this scenario, the Torah itself was simply an innocent victim, if you will, for Paul's real concern, which was the threat to his authority. So it's kind of a personal issue. So while I see the situation of the text differently today, as you mentioned, I have another book out, The rhetorical strategies outlined in this book, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, largely hold. Importantly, it was by delving into those strategies that I was better able to understand the workings of ancient authors and to learn how they made their arguments and the extent of them. I also aligned the letters of Galatians alongside other ancient writings without making distinctions or special exceptions for it as a religious writing. This work likewise led organically to a greater appreciation and interest in ancient education or paideia, and I became interested in how ancient authors were trained, a subject I take up in significant detail in the more recent book. There's an entire appendix on that. In addition, and importantly, so still answering your question, the more I learned about ancient rhetoric and how embedded it was in ancient writings, the more I was able to distance myself from face value readings. I learned, for instance, that for ancient writers, truth-telling was secondary to persuasion. And from rhetorical theory, I also came away with the understanding that discourse is not a conveyor of pre-existing truth. Rhetoric is instead the vehicle by which persons actively participate in the creation of truths. So biblical scholars will often privilege the message, if you will, and allow it to take precedence over the rhetorical creation of discourse. This perspective sees rhetoric as mere flourish. Biblical scholars can often also underestimate the inherent rhetorical nature of biblical texts and lean toward reading them, such as the letters of Paul, as genuine renderings or a type of journalism. But ancients, and this is important, were not trained to be journalists, but instead creative writers, and they were taught to persuade their audiences. Again, persuasion took precedence over factual renderings. Thus, the work brought me to a conceptual shift in how I read Pauline letters.
What is the rhetoric of crisis?
The rhetoric of crisis was simply a term coined by the current or now emeritus professor of classics, Cecil Wooten of UNC Chapel Hill. He devised the term, and with it, he was able to describe a particular type of rhetorical discourse that he observed in the Philippic speeches of Demosthenes, 4th century BCE, and Cicero, 1st century BCE. Demosthenes wrote speeches against Philip II of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And in those speeches, he warned of Philip's dire threat to Athens, naming those speeches the Philippics. Cicero patterned his senatorial speeches against the Roman Mark Antony after those speeches, and he used the same name for his speeches. But political rivalry and the preservation of one's own personal reputation and status are what's at the forefront of the rhetoric of crisis. So, and a little bit as what you mentioned in the introduction, the rhetoric of crisis brings a current situation into a state of urgent concern, and thus it employs exaggeration to bring that about. Situations are made to appear imminently threatening, even dire, and demanding an immediate response from the audience. The rhetoric of crisis aims to arouse moral outrage, especially for opponents. So you can break up this rhetoric, which I do in the book, into 4 components, and there's one chapter for each of these components. The creation, how do these authors create a sense of urgency? So it's a lot of the book is dissecting the rhetoric and then seeing how it was put forward by these authors. So the creation of a sense of urgency is one leg of it. The rhetoric of self-promotion, emotive language, and what's called disjuncture. The goal is to prompt, again, swift action toward the author's position and away from that of the author's opponent.
How does Galatians remind you of Cicero and Demosthenes?
So it's the rhetorical model and circumstances surrounding it that align the works. And as mentioned, following on the rhetorical situation created by Galatians, I saw Paul's opponents as the real problem. Specific issues or concerns were then subordinated or less important to Paul's own views and positions. Demosthenes and Cicero likewise were very much focused on their political opponents. Well, you could call Paul's opponents political if you wish. Perhaps I should say religious opponents, but opponents. In contrast to his senatorial colleagues, Aeschines and Philocrates, Demosthenes adopted a hardline approach against Philip II, who was becoming a significant threat to Athens. Cicero's Philippics comprised part of a larger struggle for power in Rome in the wake of the assassination of Julius Caesar. And he's against his senatorial rivals. Cicero opposed Mark Antony and his rise to political power, to his own detriment, actually, and argued against him. By naming his speeches after Demosthenes's, Cicero, in a sense, forced a comparison between the threat of Philip II to Athens and Mark Antony's threat to Rome. Both Demosthenes and Cicero deployed their speeches to assert and maintain their power and lifestyles. They both, interestingly, come from a place of underdog. You wouldn't think of this, but it is. If you do the research, you find this. Demosthenes' senatorial rivals were considered more politically astute than he was. And Cicero was always known as a new man. So he was an outsider, if you will, to the political elite establishment. And they both had to prove their worth. So this strong rhetoric of proving themselves, and how do you prove yourself against a rival? That was the technique. Paul, too, appears to be proving his worth, especially at the start of Galatians, where he insists upon his apostleship. He, too, forcefully derogates his unnamed opponents, suggesting they be cursed or to be demeaned incredibly strongly for their alternative views, even to the extent of self-castration, which you see in chapter 5 of Galatians.
What do you mean by persuasion through the discourse of self?
This persuasion through the discourse of self is nothing short of overt self-promotion, even exaggerated self-promotion. In rhetorical terminology, this is a form of encomium, the discourse of praise, but here's self-praise. Ironically, ancient social convention discouraged forms of self-promotion, yet ancient authors nevertheless found many ways around that and thoroughly engaged in it. Self-promotion is certainly present in Demosthenes, Cicero, and in Galatians. Demosthenes exaggerates his own good qualities, and he claims to boldly tell the truth. which is certainly a trope. He alleges to have accurate foresight. And in his 14th Philippic, Cicero loftily self-fashions, comparing himself to recent military heroes. He wasn't a military hero, and speaks of his recent public acclamation as though he was being celebrated in a military triumph. He exaggerates the size of a crowd. Like Demosthenes, he too claims to be genuine and sincere. These two orators likewise deliver these lofty self-fashionings within passages that derogate their opponents. So it's kind of a two-way street. I'm great, but my opponents, don't listen to them. They're not worthy at all. So similarly in Galatians, Paul is seen to grandiosely self-promote, and likewise within the context of his ostensible opponents. Indeed, Galatians begins with self-promotion. And as I mentioned, that's where Paul claims to be an apostle, but not only an apostle, but one who is not from human, but instead from divine commissioning. In canonical Galatians, Paul is seen to emphasize that claim through repetition. The Apostle Paul repeats that theme again in a passage defined by Galatians 1:10-17, which is his well-known kind of autobiographical passage. There too, he, like Cicero and Demosthenes, pulls the trustworthy card by claiming not to be in the business of mere persuasion. And in what is likely a common trope, he claims to have advanced in Judaism beyond his peers. Josephus makes a very similar comment regarding his own life in his Vita. All the while, Paul is seen to contrast his own lofty self-assessment with a diminished characterization of his opponents, whom he claims are not divinely sanctioned, but mere people pleasers. As I detail in my more recent book, the letter genre is particularly conducive to discussions of the self, thus ripe for self-promotion. After all, and this is what gives it a certain benefit, a letter presents in the voice of the letter sender. It's I discourse, first-person discourse. So to speak of the self comes off as what you would expect. It's entirely natural in the context of a letter. So I posit in that later book that the discourse of self, the development of the character of the Apostle Paul in lofty fashion, is likely in part what accounts for the adoption of the letter genre for Pauline discourse. In that book, I also address the many other benefits of the letter genre for ancient authors. Indeed, more studies need to be done on the benefits of the letter genre, and that may be something I'll turn to in the future.
What is disjunctive rhetoric, and what are some examples of it in Galatians?
Disjunctive rhetoric is argumentation through the employment of two opposing terms. Authors give one term a positive and superior valence or value, and the other a negative and inferior one. Disjuncture allows authors to offer their audiences one of two mutually exclusive alternative positions. So it simplifies decision-making. Disjunctive rhetoric unmasks the construction of position-taking. Thus, it reveals the authorial control of the discourse, how authors determine the opposing options and their respective values. Again, with disjunctive rhetoric, authors can handily steer their audiences to what they determine to be the right course of action. An example of a disjunctive pair, which will be familiar to you and to others, is the often deployed by both orators and the author of Galatians, the antithesis between slavery and freedom. This antithetical pair is highly effective, as everyone in the ancient world knew the value difference between these two states. The slavery element was made to represent the side of the author's opponent. Freedom was always on the author's side. So the author of Galatians also employs this antithetical pair, slavery and freedom, and like Demosthenes and Cicero, lines up a host of other antithetical pairs, many of which are wholly constructed, completely constructed out of nothing, you might say. 21 oppositional pairs have been identified in canonical Galatians. These pairs include those that you're likely familiar with: flesh versus spirit, works of the law versus trust, Mount Sinai versus present-day Jerusalem, the present evil age versus the new world, etc. Again, disjunctive rhetoric enables the creation of dichotomies where none previously existed. So there was no necessary distinction between works of the law and trust, or flesh and spirit, before they appear within the argumentation of Galatians. When aligned with the category of slavery, works of the law and flesh are made to fall on the side to be avoided.
And in my closing question, is Galatians portraying Paul as anti-Torah?
So this is a $64,000 question. I answered it a little bit at the beginning. The question certainly gets at the heart of much of current and even past Pauline scholarship. So I'll answer it in a couple of ways. So based on the argumentation of Galatians and face value readings, so this is prior to either of my books, it does look as though Paul is anti-Torah. Indeed, that was the long-standing understanding of Paul for centuries. But Pauline scholars now ask why we see this kind of anti-Torah rhetoric, even as the apostle is seen not to address Jews with his comments or discussions, but Gentiles, which is seemingly to diminish that anti-Torah take. Other scholars will variously diminish the anti-Torah emphasis of the letter. In the Rhetoric of Crisis book, as mentioned, I argue that Paul is not anti-Torah, as I mentioned, but instead he employs the Torah as a pawn to deal with his real concern, which is the threat to his own authority, these opponents. He sees that authority thwarted. To demean his opponents, he resorts to demeaning the Torah. However, in my soon-to-be-published book, should be out in a few weeks now, which takes up the question of the status or the character of Pauline letters, I make additional observations. And I subsequently came also to the realization that one could not necessarily rely on the rhetorical situation as posited by the letter of Galatians to determine the motivation for the rhetoric. That is, the opponents themselves were also likely a construction deployed for the purpose of effective argumentation. Otherwise put, arguing against a position provides a means of arguing for one's own position. So it's easy to set up opponents. The other side then serves as a foil. In this later work, the newer book, I position Pauline letters in a 2nd century post-Bar Kokhba milieu. I assess that socio-historical circumstances of that era made Torah adherence tenuous among certain groups of writers. We can call this group of writers early Christians. Arguing often from Hebrew scriptures themselves, they provide alternative interpretations of those scriptures. They offer new rules and new theological orientations. It was the events of Bar Kokhba, the third Jewish confrontation with Rome, which ended in massive loss of life of Jews and Romans, and spelled the definitive end of the Jewish temple in the territory of Judea. And this era likely saw Roman legislation against circumcision, albeit temporarily. It is at this time, I argue, that the Apostle Paul, through letters, is made to be a standout figure, a divinely commissioned messenger and apostle who articulates part of this new and burgeoning theological orientation.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Nina Livesey.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to remind everybody to go get her book, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis. I have the link to purchase her book in the description below, the History Valley Amazon affiliate link, and to pre-order her upcoming book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I really appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.